Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, America, the petro bully. In 2025, there was a growing chorus of voices saying that the US was acting like a petrostate. In the opening days of 2026, that has become undeniable. Over the weekend, President Donald Trump authorized the capture and extraction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from the country's capital, Caracas. And in the press conference discussing the reasons for the action, Trump said one of America's main priorities in Venezuela was to get access to its vast oil reserves, the largest in the world.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
If there was any doubt that America is doubling down on oil, that doubt is now gone.
We built Venezuela oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill, and the socialist regime stole it from us during those previous administrations, and they stole it through force. This constituted one of the largest thefts of American property in the history of our country.
Back in November at COP30 in Brazil, I was able to sit down with the US Senator Sheldon Whitehouse to ask how countries can stand up to America, the petro bully. Whitehouse has been the senator of the state of Rhode Island since 2007, and he has been an outspoken advocate for climate action. On that front, he's been critical of both the Trump administration and Joe Biden's administration before that. In this conversation, we didn't talk about Venezuela, but you'll see how clearly he connects the dots to explain why the US is taking these kinds of actions. I also asked Senator Whitehouse how countries can resist an increasingly aggressive Trump administration, why Democrats are shying away from the climate debate, and why he believes we can't win the climate fight without carbon pricing. By the way, if you have feedback for Zero or guest suggestions, please write to zeropod@bloomberg.net. Senator, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
So there are very few people with your ability to communicate climate issues and your experience of doing it for the length of time that you have done it. We will talk a lot about climate, but I want us to start a little bit in history. If you look at what the Trump administration is doing on all sorts of policies, domestically and abroad, not just climate, where would you put Donald Trump in America's historical context and what it's doing to the geopolitics?
I think he would probably consider himself a Jacksonian disruptor in the great sweep of American history. I think he is actually the first great collapse into corruption of American democracy. I think that the benchmark of essentially everything he does is corruption.
And this is something that Americans, because of their history of not having a corrupt government for very long, seems an aberration. But for places where I come from, in India or here where we are in Brazil, in developing countries, corruption has been an issue. So
it also means that Americans aren't as attentive and prepared. We have lived in a very happy pair of centuries in which corruption really was not a very significant national issue. And now suddenly we're deep into corruption.
And then when it comes to climate policies itself, we've seen the Trump administration obviously attack domestic climate policies, turn back the tide on the Inflation Reduction Act, go after oil and gas drilling rights in all sorts of places, including Alaska more recently. But globally, in the first Trump administration, there hadn't been that much impact. This time around, they're way more effective. Why are they so effective?
This time, they are more effective because the relationship between them and the fossil fuel industry is now one that has no boundary. The fossil fuel industry is essentially running the United States government from the inside. It's a desperate industry. They know that clean, renewable energy is cheaper. They know that they only compete by virtue of massive subsidies from being allowed to pollute for free, which nobody should be allowed to do. And they prop all of that up with enormous amounts of political corruption and leverage and a huge climate denial fraud campaign. So for them to be able to seize and capture the Trump administration and drive their desperate agenda is essential. It's a survival thing for them. So with Trump having handed them the keys, they're now in survival mode, and they're attacking everything that they can that is a threat to the continued dominance of fossil fuel.
So we have seen an actor on the international stage who has been very effective at being able to keep fossil fuel activities for longer, which is Saudi Arabia. They train some of the best diplomats here at COP, but at many other multilateral forums. They know where to find the loopholes to try and block progress. The US has some very good diplomats too. If that is the level of effectiveness we are going to see in year one of Donald Trump, there are 3 more years. How much damage does that do to American credibility at the global stage? And how do you get America back if there is a president who cares about climate change?
It could do a lot of damage. I think it is important to see America pushing back against this regime and its corrupt fossil fuel policies. So we get now to the communications problem that you mentioned earlier. I think if America's just sitting around idly, whistling and looking at the ceiling while Trump does all this damage and behaves really like a thug and serves his big political donors in the fossil fuel industry exclusively, and there's no quarrel with that, there'll be a lot more damage to America's reputation. If that kicks off a strong quarrel, which it ought to, because he is not representing the American people are miles away from Trump policies on all of this, then I think the recovery of our reputation and standing will come much quicker.
Now, looking forward to trying to get people elected in America who would act on climate action.
Yeah.
They need to get a message out that actually gets people voting for them.
Yeah.
And right now, if we look at the Democrats, one strand of Democrats who are succeeding because they are not talking about climate change. Does that worry you?
No, and I don't even know that that's true. I wouldn't accept that premise. I see it differently. I think that for a long time, the Democratic Party has been way too timid on climate stuff. President Obama walked away from Nancy Pelosi's cap and trade bill when he had the votes to pass it. But he just didn't want to put the effort in, and he didn't want to have a fight. So he literally walked away from a winning position. Joe Biden couldn't say a serious word about climate to save his life. They wouldn't pick any fights with the fossil fuel industry. They settled for an IRA bill that was not an adequate solution to the climate crisis. It was rare for him to mention climate, except when he was dealing with, climate-related advocates. We had no courage of our own convictions. And I think that communicates itself to people. When you see a party that is half-hearted and hedging about an issue where you feel passionately, where you know the science, where you see the urgency, it's hard to get very excited about that party. So I think what's been missing all along is a sense of urgency. The American public is ahead of the Democratic Party on this, and we have multiple advantages. First, the public is ahead of us, but second, the Republican Party is in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. Nobody would ever point that out. The Biden administration would not talk about a villain under any circumstances. They thought that being officer friendly and Mr. Nice Guy was going to get them through the climate crisis. Meanwhile, on the other side of the table is this gang of fossil fuel monsters running the biggest climate denial fraud campaign in history, running a huge dark money corruption operation, trying to undermine and destroy the clean energy industry. I mean, it's a very, very dangerous and malevolent group of people. And we acted as if they were either not there or that was normal. So I think what people want is for the Democratic Party to take a much more clear fighting stance on this issue. And it's all going to become a lot more real as it starts to land in people's homeowners insurance, electric bills, mortgage availability, the economic side that is under really immediate climate threat.
So if we look at the recent successes in the Democratic Party, those are the issues that those successes came on. Zohran Mamdani in New York City, in Virginia, in Georgia, in New Jersey, it was price of energy, price of housing. That is the stuff that won the Democrats, not climate change. But yes, these things are connected to climate issues.
And one can connect them. But part of the problem is that we haven't done a very good job of it. I mean, I have sat in on high-level briefings to the Democratic Senate caucus where the pollsters that were brought in to brief us on the issues hadn't bothered to ask a question about climate change, where they hadn't bothered to ask a question about dark money corruption. We have simply not been engaged in this in a way that has allowed us to be confident about the message that we can win with on this.
Where are the experiments happening in the Democratic Party to try and make those connections happen? Because the winning Democrats right now are winning on the issues, but not connecting them to climate.
I think we are going to see this more in the coming elections along the Gulf Coast. The first Democratic candidate for governor in Florida is already talking a lot about homeowners insurance and what a catastrophe that is for Floridians and how Republicans can't be trusted on this subject because they're completely in the pocket of the climate deniers. And that's the heart of the insurance problem. In Texas, we just took a poll. 92% of Texan voters are concerned about homeowners insurance. 2/3 of them connect that to climate change and extreme weather. That's a big issue for Democratic candidates down there. 92% was more than healthcare, more than groceries. So this is an available front-of-mind issue for voters that Democrats have misunderstood and ignored. And we're only better than the Republicans because they're absolutely awful on this and are on the payroll of the fossil fuel industry.
If you look at other communicators who are able to get their climate message out, are there people that you look up to who are people who are making their voices heard and actually connecting it to the issues that people care about because you need those votes?
Well, I think the Australians have done a very, very good job. They had the same thing we had. They had a right-wing government that was in the pocket of, in its case, coal industry as much as oil and gas. They were denying climate change. It was the full fossil fuel nonsense package. And then the Labor government came in and reversed their bad climate policies and started to talk about climate in a different way and act on climate in a different way. And now they've run up to, I think, 40% of Australian homes have solar panels on the roof. And they're headed for 70, 80%. And they're building behind that, having domestic battery storage. So you're off the grid on your own battery. They are working on a plan to give Australians 3 free hours of electricity a day because they've built so much abundance of solar and wind that they can do that. And they just got reelected with a big margin, and they had put climate at the front of their policy agenda. So I think Australia is very good proof of if you're actually doing things, if you're not half-hearted, and if you're bringing people along economically with all of this, this can be a big win.
They're also very good at doing it cheaply. A solar panel on the rooftop costs about $800 a kilowatt in Australia, whereas it costs $2,500 a kilowatt in America. But take a case of the country I live in, the UK, which just on numbers is a climate leader, has cut the most emissions among the G7 countries and the fastest. And it doesn't have much of the fossil fuel industry left. The North Sea oil and gas industry has been declining for decades now.
And the result of that is that both of your parties are reasonable on climate. It was a conservative government that got into that aligned with the CBAM.
Indeed, but they are no longer. And that is what I wanted to ask you, which is if you look at the politics in the UK now, Labour government has a clear majority and has 3.5 years left on the clock. But on the opposition, that's Conservative Party and now an upswing in Reform Party, both of them
want to get rid of net zero goals. The Conservative Party, which brought in the net zero goal, now wants to get rid of the Climate Change Act itself.
Yeah.
So it's not just fossil fuels. What else is driving this backlash against climate?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with UK politics. In the US, it is fossil fuel, and fossil fuel. In the EU, I think it is a little bit of fossil fuel. I think a lot of it is also Russia, Putin, and his manipulation in European democracies. His is a petrostate. He is a petro dictator. My friend in the Senate, John McCain, used to say that Russia is a gas station run by gangsters that happens to have an army. And you take away the gas station and the whole game collapses. He can't pay off his oligarchs any longer. So for him, it's pretty existential. Those, to me, have been the prime movers, and they've been able to turn it into a bit of a culture war phenomenon also.
And one way in which you think globally we can start to actually get on pace with climate action is through what is in the European jargon known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is
CBAM.
Really just a CBAM is a nice acronym, but a fancy way of saying a carbon tariff. That if you are going to send in goods from India or China, which have typically higher emissions intensity, but they come into Europe where if the same good is made, it will have lower emissions intensity. The difference between the two is where you pay a carbon tariff, and thus you protect domestic industry who are doing the activities in a cleaner way.
And you prevent cheating against proper environmental standards.
Right.
Yes.
And this is something you can do domestically. The European Union has agreed to set it up, and it has extraterritorial impacts. China's carbon pricing partly was driven because Europe was very clear that it's going to do this at some point. Then comes the US, and we know that extraterritoriality right now for the Trump administration is an issue that they would bully other countries to back down on. They're doing this not just on climate, but on ESG issues like reporting on emissions from a corporate level. They're doing this on the tax that EU and Canada wanted to put on tech companies, which tend to be American. Extraterritoriality from a climate perspective is great, but from a perspective of ensuring it lasts for decades to come seems difficult. So how do you make CBAM work when America is not interested?
First, a couple of things about CBAM. It's already law in the EU, and to unwind it would take a lot of parliamentary activity. So this is not just a proposal. It's there. Second, the UK is in the final stages of joining. They're already in a place where they don't have to pay tariffs, and they're working towards charging their own tariffs. Australia's right out there also. They're getting ready to join as well. There's every reason to believe that Canada should also join, and nobody understands the dangers to the world economy from climate better than Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was a leading voice when he ran the Bank of England. So it's a growing, I hope, safety measure, as well as a solid safety measure. The Trumpsters are probably going to try to attack it. They recently launched a really brutal and devilish attack against the International Maritime Organization that was putting a shipping fee, an emissions fee on shipping, that its members agreed to. The major shippers wanted this. There's no American ship involved because we don't do container shipping. The price effect on American consumers would be negligible, certainly compared to Trump's tariffs. And so there was no real reason for the savagery of their attack, which in diplomatic terms was unprecedented. And yet they did it. So why did they do it? They did it because Trump is the face of fossil fuel, the real face of fossil fuel, not the friendly smiling mask you get here at COPs and things like that. The real face of fossil fuel is Trump and his activities. So what the CBAM folks need to do is to understand that they're coming and be ready to steel themselves for that fight, to be prepared and to understand that they can't let individual countries chicken out, be picked off. One thing about Trump, if you are resolute in standing up against him. And if you're a group and you stand together and don't back away, can't pick off individuals, he will move on to something else.
Give me an example.
The universities that told him to go shove it when he tried to take over their internal policies. The law firms that told him to shove it when he tried to demand tribute from them. Those institutions have actually done very well for doing that, and they found others and they stuck together. The ones that gave in turned out to have been in a very difficult situation. In fact, the law firms that gave in are having trouble hiring because people don't want to work for a firm that would cave in like that. And they're having trouble with their clients because if you want a lawyer who is going to cave in to political pressure from the administration, what happens if you need to sue the administration? You can't have a lawyer who's proven they won't fight for you. So I think those are some examples of where, not like being deliberately unpleasant, not putting a stick in the eye of the administration, but just saying no, just standing fast and refusing to be bullied. That works. But you will do better at standing fast and refusing to be bullied if you appreciate that that's what's coming and you need to be ready for it.
After the break, I asked Senator Whitehouse why climate advocates seem to steer away from decisive action after they get into power. And if you're enjoying Zero, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. It helps new listeners discover the show. Thank you.
You brought up Canada, you brought up Mark Carney. You're right. He's probably the only world leader in G7 country who was a UN climate champion before he took on that role. His first policy sign-off after getting elected was to get rid of the consumer carbon tax. His most recent policy update in the budget has been to get rid of the oil and gas cap on emissions that the previous administration under Justin Trudeau was going to bring in. Claudia Scheinbaum, an environmental engineering graduate who knows this stuff really well, but her policies on climate are nowhere close to the level of action that is needed. Say you were to run for president and become president. You know the stuff in and out. What we've seen from other world leaders is that when they get into power, they change, even when they know the science. How do you stick with it?
I'm not in that position, so
would you run for president? I can't tell you,
but I'm not sure that I haven't had a chance to speak to Prime Minister Carney. I know that he knows this well. I know that he understands the dangers. And I don't know what his plan is as to how to go forward. Maybe his plan is to join the CBAM, in which case that's probably stronger. Consumer carbon taxes have never been effective, and they've never been good. The carbon pricing measures that I have recommended have always been at the extraction or importation level. And a lot of that then goes away before it gets, through multiple corporate layers and down ultimately to an oil pump or a plastics product or whatever. And you don't have to start very big to have a market effect as long as the companies that are doing the polluting, that are buying these products, know that here's where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. So you can plan a quite intelligent and very effective emissions reduction regime, but you also have to be willing to communicate about it. You've got to be willing to communicate that, people shouldn't be allowed to pollute for free. People get that. I mean, that's a huge 74-10. Americans believe that people who pollute should pay the cost of their pollution. That's a huge, that's a wipeout of a majority. So we can step into that. We can take advantage of that. I think this is an issue that the political class has misunderstood.
You've used the analogy that carbon pricing is a lifeboat, that without this, we don't have a chance of actually tackling climate change.
Correct.
There is a danger with that message, is the danger with the 1.5 degrees Celsius message that, if we can't keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are doomed. That message also doesn't go well with public. There's a clock on the UK pavilion that says after 3 years, 259 days and 72 hours or whatever, you're going to have irreversible climate change. And that's the kind of message that hasn't really worked.
I don't think it's factually correct either. So there's a lot of stupid stuff that is said in the climate space. So you can't just go chasing down the rabbit holes of every stupid thing that gets said in the climate space. You got to focus on what counts. And what counts right now is that our chance at a pathway to climate safety requires ending the economically wrongful and morally wrongful freedom of the fossil fuel industry to pollute. That is a violation of basic laws of economics. It is also a violation of basic laws of decency and good manners. So we shouldn't have a big fight about that. We also know when you look at the 1,200 climate scenarios presented to the IPCC, only 11 remain that get us a pathway to climate safety. All 11 require there to be a price on carbon. Because we have failed for so long on climate and satisfied ourselves with broad talk about ambition, we haven't focused on what we actually need to do. And we now need to come into focus. What we actually need to do is end the free-to-pollute business model. Even then, all those 11 scenarios overshoot. We will go above 1.5 degrees. So we also have to be able to have the technology to pull that excess carbon dioxide back out of the air to reduce the Earth's carbon concentration to a livable level for humankind. These should not be complicated things to discuss, except for the fact that the fossil fuel industry has this massive apparatus of lying and propaganda and climate fraud, and they're bribing and corrupting administrations and governments with the enormous amount of money that they get from having it be free to pollute. So we just have to steel ourselves for that fight and know that the public will be with us because it's common sense.
But if we go with carbon pricing is the lifeboat, and we end up in a place where the EU, through years, because it might take years before the votes to undo CBAM happens. If that comes through,
then we're done. Then we've made an incredibly stupid and irresponsible decision for our children and grandchildren. And the generation that does that will be a generation that will be last in shame through history. We have to stand up to this problem, and we have to do it now. And we can. There is a winning path.
If we look at the damages done from climate change, insured, non-insured damages altogether, last year, one assessment says it was $1.4 trillion.
Yep.
More than $800 billion of that was in the United States.
Yep.
This happened under a Joe Biden presidency. He was president last year.
Yeah, I don't think the presidency was to blame for that.
No, but the message didn't get through. If $800 billion of American economy was wiped out because of climate damages alone, why is the economic message not really?
Because name one time Joe Biden spoke about that. They were terrible about communicating the climate problem. We had to fight them to get a methane fee. They were trying to undermine the CBAM. The fact that we got the IRA through was something that there's a lot of self-laudatory noise about that. But basically, the Biden administration was a climate failure. And you can't look at a climate failure and say, your messaging didn't work. Of course it didn't work. You were a failure. Had they done it correctly, had they talked about the danger, had they talked about the damage, had they pointed out what was already starting to happen in Florida to homeowners insurance, it would be a very different world.
Who are other people in the Democratic Party who you look up to who will form this alliance to try and finally bring the climate message in the way it needs to be brought to the American people?
Well, in the Senate, I have a little triumvirate that has been working together. My climate trio, it's Senator Schatz, who is likely to be the next Democratic whip, the number 2 position in the Senate. And Martin Heinrich, who is a trained engineer, so he understands all this stuff. And he's from New Mexico, which is an oil and gas state. So he has to be really good about messaging what he's doing. He just won big as a huge climate advocate in an oil and gas state. So I think people like him are good messengers for us. I also think that Catherine Cortez Masto has done a good job politically with this issue. When the Biden administration was panicked about gas prices, and the huge apparatus of lies of the fossil fuel industry was calling this the Biden gas price hike, she was running in Nevada, a very purple state, and they were trying to come after her with this. Most Democrats went and hid, tried to change the subject. She seized that topic, and she went after her opponent and said, look at all of your climate connections. Look at who you've lobbied for. Look at what your party does. She went on offense. And by the time that race was over, this was her issue that she was beating her opponent down with, rather than something where she was trying to hide and find shelter. And when the Biden administration finally picked this up and took the fight back to the fossil fuel industry and pointed out the grotesque profits that they had made during this period, suddenly the issue shifted in the public mind. So it proves that when you have a smart position and pursue it aggressively, you can turn this around. Our problem isn't that climate messages can't win. Our problem is that we haven't had smart climate messages that we have pursued aggressively. They are there, we just didn't do it. And obviously, if you've got pollsters who won't even poll the question, you're a party that hasn't really got very good situational awareness about this.
We just had a 54-day shutdown in the US, and we saw how committed Donald Trump is to not blinking first. So what is the lesson there for other countries, such as the Europeans, on CBAM?
I think that the Trump administration responds very poorly to provocation and insult. I think they respond very respectfully to resolute firmness. They are bullies. It is their tactic. And once a bully knows that he can push you around, he is going to continue to push you around because he knows he can do it. So I think it becomes very important that you not necessarily tease the bully, but that you stand firm against the bully. The surprise attack against the IMO came quite suddenly. I was at the Oceans Conference in June and met with the IMO and said, how's this going to go? Are you going to be able to hang in on this? Because this is a really important test for the future. This is an actual price on carbon emissions, and we need that to succeed on climate. Oh, no, we got this. This is fine. Yeah, I know the Trump people don't like it, but we've really put a lot of effort into this. The companies that are the leading companies all support us. We're good to go. There's no danger of anything happening. Well, then came the surprise attack and this unprecedented level of diplomatic bullying, and the whole thing fell apart. So I hope that that's a lesson for other international groups, that you really have to steel yourself and not allow yourself to be panicked and picked off. They picked some of the weaker members off first and began to take advantage of that. I think if the IMO had seen that attack coming, they might have been more resolute about standing up.
But arguably, you've already seen the Europeans compromising when they signed the trade deal and agreed to $750 billion worth of imports of natural gas and oil from the US. So why do you think they can stand up to Trump on CBAM?
It's hard to figure that out. There's always back and forth when tariffs are being negotiated. I do think when it's as vital as the CBAM, when it is in fact the last lifeboat, if we don't have that carbon pricing regime and we just cascade forward into worse and worse economic and financial disasters because of the climate threat, then we will regret that very, very, very deeply. So you know what the fossil fuel industry wants to target. They live on a $700 billion subsidy in the United States alone, the value of being allowed to pollute for free. $700 billion is a lot of money. It motivates a lot of corruption. It makes money available for enormous flotillas of front groups to operate the climate fraud operation that they run. It's a big, big operation. And I think you've got to distinguish between when that operation comes after you using Trump administration officials and just the ordinary back and forth and give and take of regular, sometimes difficult negotiations. On the CBAM, they've got to be ready for that operation coming at them using Trump as its tool. Right now, our success or failure on climate largely hangs on whether or not the CBAM is protected and whether or not it grows, whether or not the UK and Australia continue to come on in. And that perhaps the most important thing that the EU countries are doing for the future, a heroic moment, is to do this and to hold. But the IMO ought to be a lesson to them that the fossil fuels administration is desperate and engaged in evil behavior constantly. Unless you think climate denial, fraud, and dark money corruption are fine, it's pretty evil stuff. And they have the United States government right now as their tool to bring pressure to bear. So you really have to be prepared for unusual amounts of pressure. But the lesson of Trump is that if you do, in fact, stand up to him, and if you don't break ranks and flee, then you can prevail.
One country that has stood up to Trump has been China. And it has some trump cards, like the critical minerals that it produces and refines in a monopolistic way almost. And it has succeeded wildly in being able to get its way with the Trump administration. But crucially, it's also the place which is bringing energy prices down, bringing electricity prices down, building the most amount of electricity infrastructure, the form of energy that's the form of energy the 21st century needs, wants. At the same time, the US is moving away from clean energy, but moving away from electrification, more importantly. How worried are you about the competitiveness issues that will raise when Trump leaves office?
Very. Economic competition, technological innovation, those are races. And different economies compete to do the best in those races. And Trump, for the benefit of his fossil fuel donors, corruptly is hobbling his own country in that competition. And, you can hope and believe that because American innovation and entrepreneurship is so great that if we have to stop in a race and let other countries run past us and away for years, we can get back in the race at some point and catch up. But how stupid is it to step out of the race for those years? And I think there's going to be a significant economic price that the country will pay for that. I've driven by the BYD dealerships here in Brazil, and Brazil's a big market for vehicles. This would be a nice place to have a lot of American cars be sold, but the Chinese are mopping up in the Brazilian market, in our hemisphere, in a fellow democracy, all of that. So I don't see the wisdom of kicking our own automotive companies in the teeth and saying you've got to build internal combustion engines when the future is going a different way does anybody any good, except his fossil fuel patrons. This is corruption. This is payback. You've got to see it in those terms.
The BYD factory in Brazil was built on the same site as the Ford factory.
How about that for a metaphor?
Thank you, Senator.
Good to be with you.
And thank you for listening to Zero. Now for the sound of the week. That is the sound of bees making honey inside their hive. Reporting from Bloomberg shows that honeybees are under threat in the US as grasslands are transformed to grow corn for biofuels. Read the full article on bloomberg.com/green. It's also linked in the show notes. If you liked this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd, and our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Jennifer DeLuey, Somar Sadi, Moses Andem, Laura Milan, and Sharon Chen. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.